before we move off this topic, showing you what's in evidence as State's Exhibit 411A, referring to the inner portion of the right mandible or right jawbone. Based on your training and experience as a forensic anthropologist, are you able to tell us from which direction the instrument would have entered to cause the marks that we see here in State's Exhibit 411A?
Yes, all of the marks that are observed on the lingual surface of the mandible are most consistent with an inferior to superior. So as if you went from the underneath, the bottom portion of the mandible. There is no indication that the implement that caused those defects came from the superior, because this area is much more exposed, easier to get to, and also there is no markings on the teeth that you would have to go through in order to get the markings there by any other means.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just need to make sure I understand this. You use somewhere superior. Sorry, can you just demonstrate what you mean by that explanation you gave us?
The knife most likely that caused those wounds came from the bottom and came up through the bottom portion of the chin. Because in order to get those from the superior, you would have to go into and through the mouth.
And you said earlier that there's no indication that the blade or knife that would have caused these wounds came from above. They would all have come from below the jaw. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you testified that you had been assigned as a forensic anthropologist working for the United States government. Well, first of all, as an employee with the United States government, are you military or are you a citizen?
I'm a citizen.
And you testified earlier that you would have worked at about 100 cases while employed in your current position. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Have you ever been assigned to any case where what you have essentially is two pieces of a jawbone, some teeth, the palate, and the long bone?
Yeah, it's actually very common for us to receive fragmentary
So
remains.
you've worked these type of cases before?
Yes.
Okay, now let me turn your attention to State's Exhibit 415. What are you looking at there?
This is a side view of that small long bone fragment.
Okay. Is this the same long bone fragment that you just showed us, and you testified that it's either part of the upper arm or the thigh bone of a person?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And so what are we looking at there in this photograph?
Here you're looking at the side view of one of the longitudinal fractures. And you're also seeing an unusual defect on the superior aspect.
Okay. I'm going to show you another photograph. This one arrow or this one? Okay, I'm going to show you a closer up of that. Okay, so you mentioned that about a defect. Do you see that there in this photograph?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Taylor, step down and get an approach monitor. Okay, Dr. Taylor, if you could approach the monitor and show us what you're referring to.
The defect I'm referring to is this V-shaped defect, as well as this scooped out region of bone.
And in looking at this defect, are you able to tell us what type of instrument or tool, if any, would have created this?
This is consistent with the other tool marks that I've observed in the mandible. However, I cannot clearly state that this was a knife-incised wound because of the lack of associated bone.
When you say the lack of associated bone, what do you mean by that?
Is it being such a small fragment, and the fact that this surface is the inner portion of your bone. So the long bones are hollow inside, and you have an opening. This area is on the inside of the bone, which is a very unusual location to find something of that type. So without any associated evidence, I cannot.
Okay. So in your, if this were an upper, if this were the bone of a person's upper arm, when you say inner portion, which portion of what would that be?
This would be the actual internal table. So you would have to cut the bone completely in half, and you would see that it's circular, and you have an opening right here. And what you're looking at is the surface, the inside surface. So I'm not looking at the outside surface of the bone.
Okay, so this is the inner, this is inside the outer portion of the bone?
Yes.
Would the same hold true if this were a thigh bone?
Yes.
Okay, and showing you State's Exhibit 416A. Is this the same image side by side with the previous two photographs?
Yes.
Please have a seat. Now, Dr. Taylor, you also mentioned as part of your work experience, as well as your position as a forensic anthropologist with the United States government, you also try to assess whether animal activity was involved when you do a trauma analysis on bone. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And what type of training, if any, and education do you have in that area?
I've received both formal classroom lecture training in the taxonomic process, which involves animal activity, as well as firsthand experience through my research and position with the Forensic Anthropology Center.
Okay. So you've done your own research on that as well?
Yes.
Okay. And you've also said, based on your own work experience through the Forensic Anthropology Center?
Yes.
And what type of experience is that? Work experience.
The work experience is we observe on a daily basis, or I should say I have had in the past observed on a daily basis the type of effects that animals could cause to the body during the decomposition process. Anything from your small rodents to your larger carnivores, being like dogs, the most typical.
Have you ever received any education or done any studies or research with respect to larger animals, larger than dogs, such as wild pigs or bears?
With particularly both bears and wild boar, both actually indigenous to eastern Tennessee.
The wild boars are too?
Yes.
Okay. And are there distinguishing factors when a wild pig or a boar were to leave marks on skeletal remains or skeleton versus 2 marks from another human being?
Yes, a matter of fact is that actually bears and wild boar are very similar. They're in a group called omnivores. Omnivores eat anything, so they eat both meat and vegetables. Because of that, they have very unique dental morphology, so their teeth are designed for what they eat. Because of that, you will see a lot of times crushing of bone in an area where an animal has gone in, particularly, again, the bears and the boar. They will come in and they will actually crush the end of the bone, creating very small slivers. Like if you think about, you dropped a vase on the ground, it breaks up into lots of little tiny pieces and your bigger pieces. And that's a lot of times what you see in situations where you have boar and bear. And
as far as, are you familiar with the tusks of a boar?
Yes.
If a boar were to use its tusks, would it leave the same 2 marks as, say, a serrated knife edge, like a steak knife?
You would actually see a difference.
Okay. And can you please describe what is that difference?
Because a tusk is actually a rounded instrument for lack of better words, is that so you have a rounded surface, it would actually create a channel, a scooped out appearance to the bone, where a blade, particularly a knife, the diagnostic feature of a knife is the fact that it's that pointed edge up to the blade. And so when you have the pointed edge creating a V-shaped, you would not see that as a result of the tusk.
And through your experience as well as research and experience as a forensic anthropologist, have you yourself noted that?
For particularly with boar, yes.
And with respect to if a boar were to, I guess, leave any type of markings on a jawbone like we have here, what type of markings would you expect?
I would have expected to see a lot more superficial, random scratching along the surface, because even though they have those very large carnassials and the tusks, is that the other teeth, when they're trying to grab a hold of the entire bone, would be impacting the bone as well. So I would expect to see a variable number of scratching and puncture wounds.
And in this case, with the right side of the jawbone, you testified earlier that you noticed groupings of cuts. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that indicative of a human causing those or an animal causing those?
Those are more indicative of a human.
You also testified when a boar or a bear were to bite into bone, it's like dropping a vase and it shatters and there's splinters, small pieces as well as larger pieces.
Yes.
Is that correct? The piece that we showed earlier to the jury, or you showed earlier to the jury, the long bone that would have either been from the back of the arm or the thigh, that's a piece of bone, correct?
Yes.
Is that indicative of animal activity?
Unfortunately, because there's so little that is there, I cannot make that distinction.
Are there, for example, when a wild boar bites into bone and leaves pieces of bone, is there anything else you would expect to see with respect to the pieces of the bone?
I would expect to see, again, indication that there is some type of tooth marking on the bone, as well as splinters or uneven surfaces to the edges.
And the bone fragment that, again, you displayed to the jury, which you thought might either be the back of the arm or the thigh bone, did you notice any splintering on that?
No, all of the margins were clean and sharp.
Did you also have a chance to examine, and I'm going to show you against Police Exhibit 403, which is an evidence. Let's start first with the palate, and I think that's the second bone from the top middle. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Again, the palate, is that the roof of the mouth?
Yes.
Okay. Now, were you able to examine that piece of bone?
Yes.
And looking at that, first of all, does it take a lot of pressure or force to remove that bone from, I guess, from a person if their body's already in a state of decomposition?
That area would be exposed when it's not normally exposed when they're in a state of decomposition.
And why do you say that?
Because the facial skeleton is one of the first areas to decompose, leaving skeletonized or partial skeletonization of that region compared to the rest of the body. So that area will then be exposed where normally it has a lot of soft tissue covering it.
Okay, so the face is the first to go for decomposition?
Typically, yes.
And did you notice any animal activity with respect to the palate or the roof of the mouth at that point?
I did not see anything that would indicate any animal activity.
And with respect to the bone that's directly above the palate, which bone is that?
That's the vomer.
And what is the vomer again?
The vomer makes the back portion of your septum. So if you think about it, what goes up into the middle of your nose.
Okay, so that's right in the base portion of the nose?
Yes, but it's in the back, so it's in the posterior.
And did you notice any animal activity with respect to that bone?
No, I did not.
Did you notice any animal activity at all with respect to the two pieces of jawbone?
No, I did not.
And with respect to the marks on the tooth and the bone area that's depicted in State's Exhibit 408, in your opinion, is that made by a tool or animal activity?
The markings that you see, particularly on the bone, are more indicative of a tool.
And can you just tell us why you arrived at that conclusion?
Again, there's no associated defects around it that would indicate animal activity.
Yeah, I'm almost done here, Doctor. I did have some questions. With respect to the decomposition process, do you have training and experience as well as education which would allow you to tell us whether it is likely for the fingernails of a person's body to fall off of their hand without being, I guess, pulled off with an instrument?
Yes.
And what does your, I guess, based on your experience as well as education and training, what can you tell us about that?
Is it your fingernails are held into the nail bed by just soft tissue. So when you start getting early stages of decomposition, the layers of your skin actually separate, causing the junction that holds your nails into place to loosen. As a result of that, typically in a hot, humid environment, you can typically get the removal of the nails just falling out within the first week of decomposition.
And with respect to hair, do you have an opinion as far as a person's hair falling out at some point or at the beginning of the decomposition stage?
Yeah. Hair, like fingernail beds, is literally just held in with the soft tissue, and as soon as the top layer of soft tissue, that skin starts separating, the hair will also start coming out and falling to the ground.
Now, Dr. Taylor, is it your opinion, or would it be consistent, based on that answer you just gave, would it, with respect to the fingernails, if a person were to remove a body that was already in a decomposed state after 3 or 4 days, and while moving the body, is it possible for the fingernails of that person to just fall off during
Yes.
removal?
Yes.
As well as hair?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Taylor, did all that you testified to, is that within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty pursuant to forensic anthropology?
Yes.
You don't have no further questions?
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Doctor.
I'm just wondering if you're familiar with an article published at a Teesside University it was published in the International Journal of Legal Medicine in August of 2008, differentiation of serrated and non-serrated blades and stab marks in bone.
I'm vaguely familiar.
Vaguely familiar, okay. How about a thesis paper presented to the Graduate Council of the Texas State University San Marcos by Karen Teichmeyer called a comparative analysis in serrated and non-serrated sharp force trauma to bone?
That one I'm not familiar with.
Now, I want to touch on something that the state left off with. If the nails were to fall out in the way that you just described, would they fall out cleanly?
Typically, yes.
Okay, so there wouldn't be any meat attached to them, for lack of a better term?
There could be, depending if they fell off while something was being drug.
But if it's just as a result of decomposition, allowing them to slide off naturally, it would just be the nail, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And when you were talking about the marks a tusk would make, you were envisioning an intact tusk, correct? One that is not chipped, for instance?
Yes.
Because you would agree that a chipped tusk could make quite different marks than an intact tusk.
That is correct, yes.
And a chipped tooth or tusk could leave serrations, is that correct?
That is possible.
Just as a non-serrated blade with a defect can leave a serration, correct?
Yes, it can create a serration.
Now, and you also mentioned that all the wounds you noticed on all the bones you examined, you determined that they're all perimordial?
Yes.
So then it's reasonably possible that they all occurred after death.
While the bone was still fresh, yes.
Now you also mentioned that as part of the work at the University of Tennessee that you do remove tissue from bones to have clean skeletons.
Yes.
You ever do that with a serrated blade?
I've used both a serrated scalpel as well as an axe.
Okay, but a serrated scalpel, would that be micro serrations?
Yeah, you actually would not have the type of serrations. You would still have serrations, but on a microscopic level.
I mean, when you're talking about a serrated blade, like you said, you're talking about a steak knife, something with identifiable teeth, I guess you would call them?
Yes.
Okay. Now, your work, and can you tell me again the name of the agency you work for?
The Defense POW Accounting Agency.
Okay, and that, is it fair to say that the primary work of that agency is to locate remains, determine whether or not they were service members or civilian people working in conjunction with the military, and return them?
That is our primary function, yes.
Okay. And you earned your PhD in 2013, correct?
That is correct.
And you're required to write a dissertation?
Yes.
And in your dissertation, you exceeded 200 pages?
Yes.
And to get your master's, you're required to write a thesis?
Yes.
And what was your master's thesis on?
It was a skeletal analysis of an unmarked cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee.
And that unmarked cemetery was believed to be in use in the 1800s?
Early 1900s.
Early 1900s, okay. And what was your dissertation on?
It was a paleodomography of the Arikara skeletal collection, looking at how mortality models affect our aging.
And that was about determining a person's age at time of death, correct?
Yes.
And you were looking at something known as the Taylor site?
Yes.
Specifically, and when was the Taylor site inhabited?
Actually, the Taylor site was a side project. The Taylor was not from, it was from Taylor County, Dakota.
Okay. Were you looking at a specific burial area?
I was looking at 3 different burial areas representing the entire village that was present.
Okay, and what time period was that village inhabited?
That was any of that. The date of that is the 17 to 1800s.
Okay. And you would agree that your dissertation was more about discussing how the models you use in calculating time of, or age at time of death can bias the results.
Yes.
It wasn't actually looking at and analyzing the skeletal remains themselves.
No, I actually looked over at over 1,000 skeletal remains for that.
But
that
the
research.
genesis of the paper was about how models affect the bias in the accounting. Is that fair to say?
It was talking about the models. I was specifically looking at how aging technique affects the models that we use. And so I aged every skeleton 4 different ways.
And it's important for many different studies to know the age at time of death, correct?
Yes,
Including your current work.
that's one aspect, yes.
Now, your dissertation had nothing to do with tool marks, correct?
That is correct.
Nothing to do with looking at markings left on bones by animals, correct?
No,
That is not correct.
that is correct, I'm sorry.
And now, you're an assistant coordinator at the Anatomical Donation Program in Tennessee?
At the Forensic Anthropology Center,
Where is that located at?
Knoxville, Tennessee.
And that, again, was concerned mostly with decomposition. Is that fair to say?
Yes,
And it seems like the agency, in 2014, you were working for what is known as JPAC,
yes,
and that is now merged into another agency.
that is correct.
And do you know why it merged?
It merged to eliminate redundancy in the federal government.
Wasn't there also some concerns about lack of oversight?
That is outside of my,
Well, hold on, objection, move to strike. This goes beyond the scope as well. This is not relevant.
The objection is sustained.
Would you agree that central to analyzing cut marks by tools is the identification of kerf marks?
yes,
And the type of blade used, for instance, serrated versus non-serrated, will leave identifiable kerf marks. Is that correct?
yes.
And the kerf mark is considered
I do object. Is it kerf or curve?
Kerf, it's K-E-R-F.
Thank you.
and the kerf mark is the walls of a cut in the floor, correct?
It's actually just specifically the floor.
So you don't consider the walls to be part of the kerf?
The major portion of the kerf is the actual floor of, and that's what we look at is the kerf.
Okay, but are you saying that the walls?
The
are not
walls
part-
make up part of that, but when we specifically match blades to a defect, we're talking about the floor.
Okay, but I'm just asking you. You would agree that the walls of a cut mark are part of the kerf?
In the way that you're describing, yes.
Thank you. And do you know how many different types of kerf marks have been identified as the result of being caused by serrated or non-serrated blades?
The most recent study that got published by the NIJ in 2013 identified 12 of them.
Okay, and would you agree that with respect to serrated blades, that generally it's a Y kerf mark that is left behind?
I would disagree with that, yes.
So you are not aware of any studies saying that at least in 70% of cut marks made by a serrated blade, a Y kerf mark is left behind?
Objection. Counsel is testifying unless he's going to show the literature. State objection is not in questioning.
The objection is sustained.
You indicate that striation is an indication of a serrated blade.
Pattern striation.
Okay, and pattern, that's interesting. And you can measure, because again, it would be the teeth of the serrated blade causing this, right? the striation.
Yes,
And if it's, you can measure them, and if they're accurate, then you know it's a serrated blade, correct?
No.
Like they're all at the same distance between each other.
no, the literature is actually very divisive on this issue because your common household items, particularly any of your steak knives or anything like that, they're so variable in how they are oriented to what you're cutting that there's been inconsistency in the literature shown that you can't, without a reasonable doubt, say that you have a particular type of serrated blade. You can say I have a possible serration to the blade, what you're showing is pattern striations, or a smooth edge blade, which actually shows uniform striations.
Are you aware that some forensic anthropologists specialize in the identification of tool marks?
Yes,
And in fact, some forensic anthropologists even specialize in analyzing saw and blade marks.
yes, most of the literature has been in saw marks.
And you would agree, though, that that is not your specialization?
That is not my area of research, no.
Okay. And it'd be fair to say that the focus of your work in education has not been on identification of tool marks?
None of my research has been focused on tool marks.
Okay, and it hasn't been focused on saw blades, correct?
No.
Or cut marks?
No.
Now, isn't it true that other than the general education you got in becoming a forensic anthropologist, the only specific training with regards to identifications of tool marks was a lecture in 2008?
No objection, Your Honor. The question is vague as far as general education.
I'll overrule the objection. You may answer the question.
Our experience plays a huge factor in what we are able to clearly identify and what we cannot. So the only formal training that I can produce with a certificate is from 2008. But we have continuing education that is required by my current agency as well as the amount of casework that I've had since then.
Okay, but my question was, the only specialized education you had with regards to that was a lecture in 2008, correct?
Yes.
Objection, let's change the question.
I'm sorry, your grounds again?
Well, you just changed your question, but she answered it.
All right.
Your CV is about 9 pages, correct?
Yes,
Contains classes you've taught,
yes,
publications you've published or assisted in publishing,
yes,
and nothing in your CV indicates that you have received any training in identification of tool marks in bone, correct?
yes,
And you would agree that there's nothing in your CV regarding any work you have done with respect to tool marks, correct?
that is correct.
And nothing in your CV indicates that you received any training in identification of animal marks in bone, correct?
Except, yes,
And in fact, you've never personally performed or published any papers on these subjects of tool marks or animal marks left on bone, correct?
no, I have not personally published in those topics, no.
Okay. Now you mentioned that with respect to the mandible, the major fracture indicates that it happened from the right to the left,
That is correct.
and that would be the right of the decedent.
Yes,
So if it was a typical type of punch, you would expect where two people are standing face to face, it would be a left-handed punch, correct?
I cannot surmise that.
Even though you could
Your Honor,
surmise.
I do object. That's an improper hypothetical at this point. It's not fair to Dr. Taylor the way it's
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
But you can theorize that this fracture to a jawbone is consistent with somebody sitting down in a car and punching?
Judge, objection, that wasn't the
The
only
objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Now,
The
I
question
know,
posed to the witness was a hypothetical. You can do the same if you wish, but she didn't. The reason I'm sustaining the objection is not that she theorized it, but rather She responded to a hypothetical.
You responded, thank you. You responded to a hypothetical that it's possible for this fracture to have been caused by somebody sitting down and kind of, I don't know if you've seen the old Clint Eastwood movies, but right punch clock.
Judge, that is so misleading. That wasn't
The
the
objection is
hypothetical.
sustained.
Thank you.
You'll need to rephrase your question.
And I didn't use Clint Eastwood too.
You had mentioned that there's in performing your analysis, did you use an electron scanning microscope?
No.
Did you attempt to collect any metal out of the curve mark?
No, was observed when I radiographed the remains.
You would agree, though, that if somebody wanted to determine whether the same tool caused multiple cutting, that an electron scanning microscope would aid in that?
If metal was present, yes.
What about just from the enhanced imagery of the cut itself?
That is up to the analyst.
Well, isn't it fair to say that two different knives are going to leave two different types of cut marks?
Yes.
And people who specialize in cut marks and tools could probably identify what tool created what cut mark.
Objection, that calls for speculation.
I'll overrule the objection. Yes, question.
It would be fair to say people in cut marks, in tools marks, can determine whether or not a particular tool caused a particular injury. Is that fair to say?
That is not fair to say, no.
So even with using an electron scanning microscope?
That is correct, is that especially with knife marks, very few of your board-certified forensic anthropologists will say with certainty that they can say this particular knife caused that particular defect due to the micro changes in the blade.
But based on they will be able to tell you whether or not the same instrument is used, correct?
Depending on the type of load.
To create I'm sorry, I missed the question. But there are several cut marks. Somebody with specialty tool mark analysis using an electron microscope would be able to tell you whether or not the same tool causes those different cut marks. Is that fair to say?
Not necessarily, no.
But possibly?
It is possible.
So, Judge, that calls for speculation that anything is possible.
Okay, the objection is sustained.
Thank you.
You are aware.
The state would move to strike that whole line of questioning and answer with respect to what
When
is
you say whole
possible.
line, what do you mean?
With respect to what is possible.
All right, I'll grant the motion to strike the last two questions and responses.
You're aware, again, that there are forensic anthropologists who specialize in identification of tool marks.
Objection has been answered, Your
The
Honor.
objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Are you aware that there are forensic anthropologists who claim that they can tell whether or not different cut marks were made by a single tool?
Yes, there are some anthropologists that would state that, yes.
And anthropologists who are considered who have theories that are accepted within the scientific community.
Just objection, because this is vague and ambiguous at this point. I mean, they're unnamed people with unnamed literature.
I'll sustain the objection. You'll need to rephrase that question.
Now you are aware that when a metal blade creates a kerf mark on bone, sometimes metal is left.
Yes,
You did not find any metal in this case, is that correct?
that is correct.
No. Would you agree that the left side and the right side of the mandible had a similar amount of tissue on them when you received them?
Yes,
Okay, but again, the right side had 22 cut marks and the left side none. Is that correct?
that is correct.
No further questions. Thank you.
Read it.
Thank you. In your position with the United States government, when you get deployed to, I guess, foreign countries as well as to the United States, is there a requirement that you specialize in tool marks or cut marks before you go out to do your job for the United States government?
Not for the recovery side, but for our analysis, yes.
Okay. And so for the analysis, are you qualified and certified to determine tool marks or cut marks?
As far as my agency is concerned, yes.
And have you done so for your agency?
Yes, I've passed all my competency tests.
And when you say you've passed all of your competency tests, could you explain what tests you have to go through in order to be qualified by the federal government to conduct this trauma analysis?
My agency requires, before you're allowed to conduct any independent skeletal analyses, is that you must take and do an independent skeletal analysis showing your work from start to finish. Then you are to take an 8-hour exam, a practical exam, and then you have to do 2 what we call right seat rides, where you co-author reports with a senior analyst before you can work independently.
And have you been able to do all of that before going out into the field to conduct your own trauma analysis on skeletal remains.
Yes.
And when you mentioned there's continued education, what if any does your continued education have to do with this continued, I guess, competency in this area?
Is that we have to maintain competencies, basically a basic understanding in all of the areas of which we write a report. So we have to show that we can do all of the analyses knowing the general current published literature.
And so do you keep yourself current with respect to the, I guess, the published literature and the work that you do as a forensic anthropologist for the United States government?
As much as possible, yes.
And with respect to okay, you testified that through radiology there was no metal, you saw no metal present with any of the cuts or the defects you saw on the right side of the jawbone, is that correct?
Yes.
Have you handled cases where sharp instruments such as knives were used and there were no indication of metal?
Yes.
Is that common or uncommon?
It's actually quite common.
And I'm almost done here. You also testified, and I'm not sure if I caught this correctly, you said if a person is in a decomposed state and their fingernails fall off, it normally wouldn't have any tissue attached?
If it just fell out, yes.
Okay.
There
What-
would be no.
How about skin attached?
It is possible.
And then, did you mention though, if a person was being dragged in a decomposed state, would it be possible to have their fingernails fall off with tissue attached?
Yes, it would be possible.
And skin as well?
Yes.
Oh, I know I was going to ask you. The defense lawyer asked you about a chipped tusk. Even if a boar had a chipped tusk, would you expect to see the markings that you saw on the right side of the jawbone if a boar were to have left marks on that jawbone with a chipped tusk?
I would have expected to see additional punctured pits and depressions
And what would that have been caused by?
by the other surrounding teeth.
Okay. And as far as a chipped tooth, the defense lawyer asked you whether that it's possible for a chipped tooth to leave different marks than a non-chipped tooth of an animal. You remember being asked that?
Yes.
Now, the markings that you saw on the right side of the jawbone, looking at its totality, did you see indications of a chipped tooth from an animal?
I did not see any indication of that, no.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Norton?
Mr. Rivera seems to focus quite heavily on the trauma analysis you performed during your job. Isn't it fair to say that that's not the main thrust of what you're looking for?
That's one component of every one of our reports.
But again, the main duty that you're tasked with is identification to determine whether or not this person was basically American military or a civilian contractor, so that they could be returned.
Our job is to inform the medical examiners so they can give the most complete death certificate to the families that had been waiting,
I mean,
which
what-
includes changing the manner and cause of death, and a lot of that is based on our reports.
And these, though, would all, well, but again, it's accounting. You're trying to account for missing people. Is that fair to
Objection
say?
asked and answered.
The objection is sustained.
Now, are you aware that baby pig teeth are called needle teeth?
Yes,
That's because they're super sharp, correct?
yes,
And that's not the tusks, that's the incisors and other teeth, correct?
yes,
And you'd also agree that a chipped incisor can be incredibly sharp.
yes, yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
And any signs that a baby pig did any of these damage to the right side of the jaw that you can see?
No,
Any signs whatsoever?
no signs whatsoever.
No questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Nardi,
Nothing
are there any general questions?
Yes, Your Honor.
Council, please approve. Ladies and gentlemen, what we'll do, we're at the time where we need to adjourn, and so we will have you return on Friday, September 23rd at 9 a.m. Actually, what I'll need to do is go over the questions with council, and then we'll have the witness return to the witness stand to respond to questions. So, at any rate, we'll adjourn for the day. Thank you very much for your service as jurors today, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Friday. And please keep in mind my collection of instructions here beginning of the day. Have a nice evening. Thank you so much.